senseless to just allow the country to just be overrun like that. It just, yeah, seemed pretty, you know, a bit senseless. But I feel quite lucky that I did come out unscathed, and you know, I was part of one Rifles, the 1st Battalion of the Rifles, and we did have you know, a lot of casualties. You know, I'm lucky I wasn't one of them. I'm lucky I've come away from it with, you know, with sort of no major sort of effects for myself. You know, if anything, it sounds really cold and kind of selfish, but for me personally, you know, me and my wife saved money from tours in Afghanistan, which, you know, we've gone and got a house from. So it's like, that is a, you know, a very selfish way to look at it. But I haven't had any long-term effects, but I just know people that did, and it's more kind of on their behalf, because you know. But there's also, I think there's also an element of sort of guilt in that respect as well, because I was quite lucky in that I was in positions where I could have easily have been killed, you know, multiple times, and I was, you know, sharing, you know, I was in the same platoon as people that were, like I say, horrifically injured and some killed, and I feel like there's an element of guilt to that when you do look back, because I've moved on, and it's like another lifetime to me now, because I've moved on so much. And forgotten about it almost, where I don't even really think about it much. I know that there's still people that are suffering the effects, so family members of people that were killed or people with injuries. I know that there are people out there that are still feeling that, and so that makes you feel a bit guilty sometimes, that you're like, well, I've just moved on, and you know, kind of things are going pretty well for me, and I know they're not for other people, so that there's an element of sort of guilt there, really, I think.
There'll be psychological effects though, won't there? You lived the aftermath, if you like, because if you lived within that platoon and worked within that area once people had lost their lives that you knew, there would have been some kind of effect. How was that? That's a life-changing experience in that situation.
Yeah, I think it's I don't know, it's interesting because you get, I mean, I remember very vividly when the last time I left, so we were on Op Herrick 14, which is the last tour I did, Afghan. We left our little patrol base where we'd been living and patrolled, one last patrol back up to the main sort of patrol base. This is in Nari Siraj. So we had basically a little checkpoint that we've been living. We went up to the big main base where we were able to get a helicopter back, basically to Camp Bastion, and that would be the end of the tour. I knew from that point I got into the gates of that main patrol base. That was it. You know, sort of, I'd be okay. I was sort of, it was sort of over, because you know, at that point I was like, well, there's no more. You know, there's no more time on the ground, unless there's a very, very unlikely, you know, scenario of something happening to an aircraft on the way back to Bastion. There's, you know, which is almost unheard of. That would be safe. So I remember very vividly on the last few meters on the way towards the gates, thinking, I've got my legs, I've got my legs, I've got my legs, because I knew people that didn't, you know, have their legs, and that were, you know, that were very, you know, that had their lives completely changed, and I felt like, as long as I got through those gates, those last few meters, that was okay for the rest of my life. You know, I've sort of made it, and so yeah, that was a really strange experience to sort of feel like, you know, and I got in there, and I just felt like, you know, I've just sort of like, I can't believe it, I've made it, you know, because that's the main thing that people, I think, that was obviously the main, the sort of, the most obvious sort of thing to happen was your legs were going to get blown off, and you sort of every day, every patrol, you've really felt like it could happen, at any point. And yeah. But I think one of the most striking things as well is it's not so much feeling, not so much thinking about yourself a lot of the time. So, for example, I do a lot of the time I spent at the front of a patrol doing Valen, where you use a metal detector to look for explosives that have been buried, and when you're doing stuff like that, you don't really think so much about yourself. You worry about, if I miss something, there's a lot of people behind me, and so that obviously has a big impact on your kind of on sort of having that sort of pressure of thinking, if I miss something, if there's something here, that I think has a long-term impact, because it's day after day, and I think it's I think it's one of those things that you kind of I think you do get used to risk. Like, people do normalize risk depending on their environment. They sort of, like, even if you lived in India and the roads were chaotic and you cross the road every day and you don't really think much of it, they just sort of get on with it, and they're like, well, that's just the way it is. People normalize whatever environment they're in and kind of tend to get used to risk and ignore it, get desensitized to it. So I think that's kind of that's sort of how it probably was being over there. But then you maybe afterwards you look at it and you go, okay, actually that was pretty sketchy really, to be there.
Do you think that's had a long-term effect on you now? You're not looking for IEDs now as you walk around?
No, actually it is funny, because I don't think I have got any long-term effects or anything, but I do occasionally have some sort of strange moment. Like, once in a blue moon, I have a strange moment where, for example, so if in the back garden I've got now, if I across my back garden, I can see through the fence to a building that's being built a couple of 100 meters away. And it was a couple of weeks ago that there was usually we don't see anyone working on the building. It was a couple of weeks ago that I kind of looked out of the patio doors, and there was someone on the roof of the building, and so that was a bit like, I sort of had a strange moment where I felt like not secure. I felt like there's someone on the roof, like, because if you've lived in a little checkpoint, where everything outside of that wall is potentially dangerous, everything out there is a threat, and if there's someone up on a roof, you feel like that could be someone, that's it could be someone about to start shooting at you, and you feel like that, and that has an impact. I think even years later, just seeing someone random on the roof, I had a moment where I was like, what are they doing up there? Okay, it's a builder, they're building a house. There's nothing your sort of conscious mind obviously kicks in and goes, well, there's no issue there, but for just a second you're like, what's that person doing on there? And I think I've tried to explain that to my wife before as well, because we had a situation where in my last house, she decided to get some window cleaners to regularly just sort of, just sign up to a service where window cleaners would come around sort of, I think, once a month, and they would, they just sort of come up to the back, come around the house and come up to the windows, and I think that for some reason we hadn't maybe discussed it enough. I'd got back from a trip and I was sort of working just at the kitchen table. I think this was during COVID, and there was a guy just sort of came up to the back window and started cleaning it, and that made me feel I was extremely anxious about that. The idea that, because when you've lived, like I say, in that situation, being surrounded by a wall, everything outside of that wall is hostile, everything inside is okay, and that feeling of being very security conscious, where it doesn't, there's a line between outside is anything could